For this project, you need a yard of sun protective fabric, at least a yard of double gauze fabric, 1-inch webbing, and 1-inch hook and loop sew-on tape. You'll also want a rotary cutter and mat, some sewing clips, and a ruler. Today the ruler was feeling a little bit shy. Make sure to wash the double gauze fabric. In this case, it's unwashed, which is why the lines are still straight and it looks very flat. It will puff up and shrink once it's washed. After you pre-wash the double gauze fabric, it's time to cut them both to size. I didn't show myself cutting the fabric because we all know what that looks like, but I did want to show you the fact that the sun protective fabric, while woven, is still very straight and very easy to cut. The double gauze fabric, however, loses its shape and is harder to cut, which is why the dimensions are a little bit different. After you've cut the materials to size, it's time to get everything ready for sewing. In this case, the sun protective fabric is a little bit smaller than the piece of double gauze. So what I do is I sew and then trim, sew and then trim, because the fabrics are easier to work with that way. So I start with the short edge, put the right sides together, and clip. If I do have a straight edge on one of the longer edges, I also clip the side of that as well, just so that it keeps it from shifting. But I don't clip all around the blanket. Instead, I just sew that first short edge and then see where things fall. Before you start sewing, you need to prepare the webbing. This means cutting 4 pieces of webbing that are 5 inches long. You'll also want to singe each of the edges with a lighter in order to ensure that it doesn't fray or come undone. In my case, the lighter ran out of fluid, so I had to finish my webbing off camera. It's finally time to start sewing, so take your blanket and use a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew that clipped short edge. I typically like to sew the blanket with the sun protective fabric face down. It makes it a lot easier to work with the two fabrics together. This part of the detail is a little bit hard to get a good shot for you about. Basically what I do, as I've mentioned, is cut and sew and cut and sort of work my way around, since I'm working with two fabrics that don't really like to work with each other. One's super stretchy, the other has no stretch whatsoever, and so they're at odds with each other with each time that we're clipping and sewing. So what I typically do is, as I've been doing, I sew one edge, then I sew the second edge, and I lay it out on a carpet or a flat surface where I can really work with it. And then what I do is I start clipping the edge, and I follow the straight edge, knowing it'll stretch. The gauze may have a little bit of give to it if there's a softness to it and it's not totally straight against the solar weave, that's fine. But what you do want to do is fold over this edge and then clip so you can follow the straight edge, and then you'll be able to trim it as you go and as you sew. For that one really janky edge that I already pointed out, what I do is I sew a straight line until I can't anymore, and then I stop and trim the excess fabric and then complete my sewing. We're finally down to that final edge, but we still have a good little tail of excess gauze. So fold the blanket in half and then clip the side edge that's already sewn. Then clip the long edges together so that you've created a shape that makes it easier to cut the excess gauze. Lay the blanket out flat and then make sure that the edges are lined up, and then cut your line. The edges are all lined up and ready to go, so all you need to do is clip them together to prepare for sewing. You'll also want to take those last 2 pieces of webbing and, just as you did before, insert them 1 inch away from the long edge, sandwiched in between the 2 pieces of fabric. In the middle of that final edge, make sure to leave a 3-inch turning hole so that you have space to turn the blanket right sides out. It's finally time to turn the blanket right sides out. Do so carefully, and also remember to poke out each of the corners so that it looks nice and crisp once the blanket is complete. With the blanket turned right sides out, it's time to prepare it for top stitching. So, finger press the seam all around the perimeter of the blanket, then clip so that the fabrics stay in place. Top stitch using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Cut 4 pieces of hook and loop tape that measure 2.5 inches each. Clip one side of the hook and loop tape to the webbing, then eyeball the placement for the other side of the tape and clip it to the fabric. I had to fold the fabric in just a little bit so that the clip would keep it in place, but it won't cause a problem because I have it there just so that it's held in place before I lower the presser foot. Repeat this process with the other 3 sets of sew-on tape. Use a zigzag stitch to sew all around the piece of hook tape and loop tape to secure it to the blanket and to the webbing. Repeat this process for the remaining 3 sets of hook and loop tape. Before we go, I want to tell you a little bit more about this design. When I made the original blanket 13 years ago, it was used as a stroller blanket so that parents could attach it to the top of the stroller and then drape it over the small sunshade as a curtain to cover the child completely. Since the blanket is breathable and lightweight, it can also be used as a lap blanket for a child or an adult. If you're a parent who wants to cool the car down, you can also attach this to the handles to create a temporary sunshade when you're not driving the car. And one of the best parts outside of the peace of mind that your child's got added sun protection from the blanket, it can be easily rolled up and stuffed in almost any bag because it's so thin and supple. I can't wait to give this to a special first-time parent who loves to run outside.